Good morning, everyone. 新年快乐, Happy New Year of the Tiger. My name is Jennifer Turner. I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. And this is our first Year of the Tiger meeting. This webinar today, it's part of our Clean Energy Transition series about China and often China-US issues. I'm thinking, though, that we should probably rename it the Year of the Carbon Neutral Tiger meeting series. What do you think, guys? Right? 3060 Tigers. All right. Thanks again for all of you for joining us today. We've got a great meeting in store. The title is great. Locking in a high carbon future, Chinese steel, cement, coal investments at home and abroad. I want to thank our Environmental Change and Security Program and Asia program for co-sponsoring. I have a fabulous trio here today. I've got Edmund Downie, Alvin Camba, and Angela Tritto. And kicking off our talk today is going to be Edmund Downie. He's a PhD student in Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, where he studies decarbonization pathways modeling for China and India. He actually, prior to that, when he was a non-resident fellow at Columbia University, I think that's where you started doing a lot of your exploration of cement and steel. We could talk later why you chose those topics, but I'm really glad that you did, because it's a big overlooked sector that's high carbon. So he's gonna start us off talking about China's domestic steel and cement industries, kind of the pollution, the carbon footprint, and new efforts that have been underway in China try to green this sector, because big goals by Xi Jinping to bring down carbon emissions, and they're starting to target steel and cement. And then next, we're going to have Dr. Alvin Camba. He's an assistant professor at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Great university. Nothing wrong with Princeton there, I'm just saying. I know the folks at Denver more. He's a sociologist by training, and he studies the political economy of development in the global South in the context of China's rise. Today, his talk is drawing on research he's been conducting with the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts University, with Kelly Sims Gallagher, good friend of the China Environment Forum. He will discuss how China's investment and export boom in Philippine cement and steel is generating a growing CO2 emission footprint. And then closing us out in the presentation portion is Dr. Angela Tritto, who's an adjunct assistant professor at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She's in the Division of Public Policy. She's doing a lot of work these days on, she's mainly Belt and Roadie. She's a Belt and Road person looking a lot at the same sustainability, management issues. And she's going to share stories today about Indonesia's cognitive dissonance around fossil fuels. Specifically, she's going to be telling the story of how Belt and Road has propelled a really big expansion of steel industry in Indonesia, and it's having a very big ripple effect on coal-fired power plant expansion. So I will stop tripping over my tongue, and I'm going to be muting myself. And I'd like to ask Edmund to share your slides. And I'm really looking forward to, another year of talking about decarbonization. And we're starting with cement and steel. Thank you. It's all yours, Edmund. I can see your slides fine.
Hey, can people hear me okay?
And you sound great. Look great. We're ready to go.
All right. So thanks for that generous introduction, Jennifer, and thanks all for joining. I'm excited to be here today. I'm going to talk about, I'm a PhD student, Princeton School of Public International Affairs, and I'll be presenting research that I published last August with Columbia University's CEPA's Center on Global Energy Policy about how the Chinese cement and steel sector are responding to national decarbonization goals. So in these 10 minutes, I'm going to give a high-level answer to one question. What are major Chinese firms in cement and steel doing to control and reduce their carbon emissions? And to answer that question, we're going to need to answer a few questions along the way. So first, just understand, how do cement and steel contribute to climate change? What's their carbon footprint? Second, what are China's national policies for curtailing carbon emissions, and what do they mean for heavy industry? And third, how do firms in these sectors act? How have they been acting so far to control and reduce their emissions? Answering these questions, I think, will help give us the answer that I'm going to present today, which is that firms are starting to establish plans and tools to control carbon emissions. But they've only started really in the past year, since China pledged to go carbon neutral by 2060, back in September of 2020. And it's going to take several years of continued work, regulators and firms, to entrench carbon management as a serious and well-institutionalized goal for Chinese industrial policy. Let's start with some basic data. Why do we talk about carbon emissions when we talk about cement and steel? The answer is that both sectors are important sources of global GHG and greenhouse gas and carbon emissions. So globally, they're around 6 to 8% each of global carbon emissions, depending on how you measure. That translates to around 5% of global GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So probably 10% in total. So pretty significant between those two sectors. And in China, they're even more important. So the usual rough figure that it gets pegged at is about 15% of Chinese carbon emissions from each of these sectors. So that's 30% in total of China's national emissions. Emissions come from a few elements of the production process. I'm not going to go into that too much in detail, but happy to talk about that more in Q&A if people are interested. In cement, major sources are direct fossil fuel combustion for heating cement kilns, as well as what we call process emissions. So that's byproducts of the chemical reactions that are required to produce cement. And there's also a minor amount from electricity consumption. In steel, the major sources are direct fossil fuel consumption, as well as electricity consumption as well. So now we know, right, cement and steel produce emissions. Why does this matter for China? Why is it relevant? And the answer is that China is an enormous producer of these commodities. More than half of all cement and steel worldwide is produced in China. Almost all of this is for domestic consumption. So for steel materials, exports vary between about 5 to 10% of total production during the 2010s. Cement was less than 1% annually. Cement tends to be very regional, even within China as well. But we'll get some interesting insights into the second biggest export market of China for cement, the Philippines, with Alvin's talk. But that's not to say that the outbound profiles aren't important to understand for these sectors, because outbound markets are going to be increasingly important for Chinese firms if the country is successful in shifting away from infrastructure-led growth. As it looks to do. So to give an example, in the 2010s, I said steel materials exports varied from 5% to 10%. Well, they varied basically when infrastructure spending was low in the mid-2010s, exports were high. When infrastructure spending was higher in the early 2010s, late 2010s, exports were lower. And I think that gives a sense of kind of where we might be going. And that's all not to say FDI, outbound investment, and Alvin and Angela are going to talk about that more. Okay, so let's talk policies. What does China want to do about emissions in these sectors? The answer really starts with China's 30-60 pledge issued back in September 2020. So Xi Jinping announced then that China would aim to have carbon emissions peak before 2030, that's the 30, and to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, that's the 60. And it's really only been since this pledge that Chinese firms have started to take climate issues seriously. There weren't really big policy expectations on firms before about carbon management. What mattered was energy efficiency and air pollution. And there were a lot of progress made on both. China's very energy efficient fleets in steel and cement, and on air pollution also they've made major progress over the past decade. Both these issues are obviously very important. Energy efficiency, important piece of reducing emissions, but firms didn't have standalone demands around carbon emissions beyond just reporting those emissions to the government. The pledge has started to force firms to treat climate as a policy priority, one of many policy priorities to be clear, but still priority. And that means putting more resources into emissions accounting, management, starting to incorporate climate into planning and strategy, things like that. So, carbon neutral by 2060, cement and steel, 30% of national emissions, they're going to need to be part of that drive. How do they do it? The first step is reducing output. So we already saw how dominant China is in global production of cement and steel, and that's really been driven by enormous infrastructure spending since the 2000s to drive growth. But there are only so many buildings and roads and cities you can build, in theory. And overcapacity in these sectors is an issue that policymakers have been talking about for a long time. But rating that has been very difficult, as you can see from these charts. So output growth has fallen plenty since the 2000s and the sort of early 2010s. But cement has basically kind of hovered around the same production level since the mid-2010s. Steel grew more than 5% for most of the late 2010s, with the trade war, bump up back in infrastructure spending. We do see a heartening sign in 2021, falling output in cement and steel, both sectors, for the first time since 2015. And that is actually the progress of the outcome of a real policy battle in steel. It was a big flashpoint. Government said we wanted to cut steel production this year. Industry pushed back at the start, but we ended up cutting steel production. That is a good, and carbon neutrality was explicitly cited among the various reasons for those efforts. So obviously you can reduce output. Less output means less emissions, but you also want to reduce the emissions per unit of production. That's your emissions intensity. I'm not going to go through these different ways that you can do it in detail, but happy to talk more in the Q&A. Energy efficiency, replacing coal with other fuels like waste or hydrogen or electricity in the steel sector, CCUS, changing chemical composition of cement, things like that. What I want to stress is that some of the technologies, many of the important technologies for full net zero remain largely pre-commercial, not deployed widely in commercial applications. So they're expensive and they require further R&D advances to reduce costs and scale. So getting to net zero in cement and steel is going to take a lot of work, but there are short-term ways to cut emissions and start making progress, at least, beyond just controlling output. And these sectors, they do need strategies for making those cuts and getting ready for in the short term and the long term. So what's happening so far? I'm just going to talk about targets here for reasons of time, and I can talk more about some of the kinds of measures that are being discussed if people are interested. So the sectoral targets are fairly conservative. This is how China often does targeting. They set pretty conservative targets that they know they can meet. Officials announced a targeted emissions peaking date of 2030 for steel. Sector participants have announced a 2023 target peaking date for cement. That sounds nice, 2023 pretty soon, but it's not actually hard to reach in either case. Because really, again, it's just about peaking output. And as I discussed, China's been interested in reining in overcapacity in these sectors for a long time. If you peak your output, you're going to peak your emissions. One cement researcher I spoke to said that cement has been in a peaking decade since around the mid-2010s. Don't be surprised to think of steel peaks well before 2030 as well. And China is very enthusiastic also about some parts of reducing emissions intensity, that is emissions per unit of production in these sectors, things like green hydrogen for steel, stuff like that. So these targets are conservative. They understate what China can do, but they also set a sort of a low barrier or a low sort of goal, which is something for the world to keep in mind. We also see pretty conservative targets at the firm level. So in my report for Columbia, I looked at the targets from the top 10 biggest firms in cement and steel in 2019. As of July of last year, most had not issued targets yet, or we're still watching and waiting. There's a pretty sizable expertise gap, which is part of the story. Carbon management is new for heavy industry, as I indicated. And also, I think it's likely that we're going to be waiting for more explicit government guidance and directions around target setting, a bit like what's been done in energy efficiency, where the government basically told firms, this is what you're going to do on a year-on-year basis in making progress. Wrap up, 3060 pledge, firms are starting to think about carbon emissions and strategy and operations, but there's a long way to go. It's new, and there's a lot of progress to make. And I think key question about how far and fast they'll move is going to depend on the policy environment they operate in. I'm going to leave discussion of US policy implications for the Q&A if people are interested in. This is my information, report as well, and a podcast if people are interested in, but I'm going to turn over now to Alvin.
But first to me. Thank you so much. That's great. And we will put at least some of your slides, Edmund, online. So with the ones that you give us, I think, for the podcast and things, because really, people, you got to pay it. If you're concerned about climate change, steel and cement are important sectors. Also want to mention that our little Q&A widget's broken today. So if you want to submit questions, you looking below the streaming screen, you'll see that there's Eli Patton's email, elijah.patton@wilsoncenter.org. You can also tweet us at @WilsonCEF. Please send questions in. I was typing questions as you were talking, Edmund, so you just wait. We've got good questions for you. But Alvin, could you share your screen while I'm doing the transition of let's see, I guess there's no baton passing in the Winter Olympics, but just thinking of that imagery of passing the baton. That'd be interesting. Baton passing on skis. So yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm actually looking for it.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
It's just
Yeah,
it's just confusing with having two screens.
I know that's why I only have one here at home. But at two, I had to go back to went back to my office with two screens a couple of times. I'm like, whoa, I forgot how to use them.
Okay, so I have it right now.
Okay, and
so good morning. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for waiting. That was like a hiccup in the morning. So this research is something I've been working on in my school in Joseph Corbell, and with the sponsorship of the Climate Policy Lab at Fletcher at Tufts University. So the title of the presentation is the Cement Steel Infrastructure Interface, China's Export and Investment Boom in the Philippines. Now, just quickly, I have the outline of the talk, but going beyond that, the question of this talk is, how does the Belt and Road Initiative impact host country pathway towards decarbonization? And generally, the answer here there's a big literature here, and generally the answer here, they often go in two directions. And I mean, both answers look at energy systems, energy production, like coal-fired power plants, but most answers generally focus on either the impact of China is negative when they think about coal-fired power plant investments. That's like one answer here. The other answer would be the expansion of China has a big role in the expansion of renewable energies. And for instance, like even when they talk about coal-fired power plants, the coal-fired power plants are often subcritical CFPs, so they're supposed to be more efficient. But either way, researchers tend to focus on energy systems, coal-fired power plants, renewable energy, and it really misses what I call complementary industries that generate massive amounts of carbon emissions, as what Ed talks about, the idea of like cement and steel as like massive contributors of global carbon emissions. So I'm not gonna repeat like this. I'm not gonna repeat these figures again, but cement and steel are massive contributors worldwide. Crucially, the link of that to the global south is that there's an infrastructure drive right now amongst global south countries, and the intention and the intention and sort of the vision of many host country leaders to sort of follow the Chinese development model. So you have build in the Philippines, you have the Global Maritime Fulcrum in Indonesia, you have similar initiatives in Vietnam, Pakistan, and many other places. So when you have an infrastructure drive, the link of that is it increases the demand for cement and steel. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. How does the Belt and Road Initiative impact host country pathway towards decarbonization? And the argument here is that Belt and Road has made the pursuit of infrastructure initiatives easier, generating the expansion of cement and steel through imports and investments. Now, crucially, these sectors bind the interests of Chinese firms and host country elites together. Chinese firms and the Belt and Road Initiative provide the funding for, let's say, infrastructure projects, and it gives host country elites the opportunity to sort of participate in these ventures as joint venture partners, or when they import, let's say, cement and steel and become the providers of these inputs to these infrastructure projects or any sort of infrastructure at all. Now, I'm going to talk about the case of the Philippines, which has pursued a rapprochement with the Duterte government, with the Chinese government in 2016, and it has pursued an infrastructure initiative in 2016 as well, called the Build. Now, the data I'm using here would be two data sets I created. One is something called the Security Exchange Commission data, which contains the record of over 1.5 million firms. Now, this is, in my view, very limited to the Philippines, but because of the granularity of the data set, it allows me to capture the specific joint venture partners in a particular company. So this is an example, for instance, of like a steel company in the Philippines, a very, very small one, but as you can see, of the Filipino and the Chinese partners there. And then the second data I'm using is the port entry data set. This has around, I think, 5 million to 6 million entries between 2010 and 2020, and this allows me to capture the specific sort of like commodities that are exported to the Philippines per commodity. So if the United States exports, let's say, LeBron James or Steph Curry shoes to the Philippines, then you will find it in the data set. So it's super granular. It's not aggregate, unlike what you will find in any other sort of like government website, which limits our capacity to sort of understand the nuances of like what's being exported or invested. Now, Now, just a quick introduction. So, Belt and Road projects in the Philippines. There are a couple of them, and all of them are progressing in the country. Right. This is a list of 8 projects, but there's actually more of them. I think right now they signed 2 or 3 more projects. So, but just to give a brief overview, the crucial thing about the Philippines is that Chinese foreign direct investment. So, if we think about the data set I have, this is counting the number of firms in the particular year that was created in the Philippines. And as you can see, in 2016, even before 2016, there's been a massive surge of new companies with a Chinese investor. And if you compare it to American, Japanese, Singaporean, and Taiwanese, the firms with Chinese investors definitely outweigh these other companies. Outnumber. And then if you take a look at the sectors per se, where are these companies going? They either go to wholesale or retail. Now, an even more important sector for me is like real estate activities. So real estate activities really reach a massive number during Duterte. Now, I'm on my 5th minute. I'm going to talk about the cement and steel data now. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the cement sector. So this looks at investor nationality. And then this looks at the number of new companies. So going at my data set again, the number of new companies with a new cement company, the number of new companies that are in the cement industry in the Philippines. And this looks at the investors in the particular firm. And you have the Chinese outnumbering American, Japanese, and Taiwanese. If we look at regional distribution, this is a bit messy. But the takeaway here is that they're moving away from the industrial centers of the country towards parts like Mindanao and towards like northern Luzon. So this is diffusing across the country as well to other regions. And if you take a look at the what type of cement, this is possible to do if I'm looking at a particular, cement can be divided in extraction, manufacturing, and distribution. Now, even though it's distribution, interesting enough, in the company filing, they still have manufacturing. They still have manufacturing assets in their company. So, but they listed themselves as a distributing company in the filings per se. But it's hard to sort of say that it's hard to say that they don't do anything else. But this is if you divide cement into sort of like 3 particular subsectors, then you find this distribution. In terms of cement exports from China to the Philippines, this is freight on board. So this is the value of the cement that is exported to the country. China again has outweighed outnumbered Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Russia. Now, similar story. Steel, the Chinese have outnumbered, the other investors. Regional distribution is definitely moving away from the industrial centers of the country towards, Mindanao and sort of like northern Luzon. The same story about extraction, manufacturer, and distribution. You have steel expanding as well, and ports, and going to exports again. Chinese exported steel to the country. You have China's massive amounts of exported steel to the Philippines. So you have a very similar story with steel and cement. Now, I have a couple of interviews on this, but I'm going to cite one interview. So now, in an interview with a high-level official from the DTR in the Philippines, he basically told me that the simple reason that it's expanding is because everybody wins. The oligarchs and their construction companies can construct infrastructure, access cheap supply, and partner with the Chinese firms. Local mayors and governors have new investments, revenues, bribes, and employment, and the Duterte government gets to announce more success in infrastructure projects. So going back to my hypothesis, there's a natural affinity. There's a win-win situation, and I don't like to repeat this, but there's an interface that's going on in cement, steel, and infrastructure. And this is, for me, what's driving the investments and export boom to the Philippines and perhaps other countries as well, which is not automatic because if you look at my work and Angela's work as well, Chinese projects often get elite counter mobilization, and in many occasions they get canceled in the host country simply because it doesn't align with host country interests. Now, to sum this up, I'm on my 9th minute. To me, this is a bigger trend in the global south. This is not a Philippine story. So I'm working on my Indonesia paper right now, where I find a very similar trend in Indonesia with a global maritime fulcrum. And then when I'm starting the Vietnamese component of this project. I magically found the Vietnamese RA here in the Rocky Mountain regions. It would be easier if I were in the East Coast, but here it's hard to find a Southeast Asian. So we're looking at data right now, and I'm really excited to sort of like move with this project forward in the coming years. And the future work really involves looking at trade and investment data, possibly doing field work in the Philippines and localities in other places, and potentially expanding this in many other countries, doing a network analysis, potentially with Ed's work on on cement and steel in China. And I'm on my 10th minute, so just to summarize, the expansion of CSI interface is harmful to decarbonization efforts. CSI, cement steel infrastructure, is an interface that binds together Chinese firms and host country elites. And decarbonization efforts should not only focus on supply chain, should focus on supply chains and not just energy production. Apart from that, thank you very much. If you have any questions, please email or write to me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alvin. You make me sound like I'm a draconian chair, but no, that was great. But I do have to say, and I think we'll see with Angela as well. I mean, but also even with you, Edmund, the kind of research that you do looking at cement and steel, this is mining into a lot of deep data. And no, I appreciate that. That's and I've got a lot of questions. I see Angela's getting her slides up. So, all right, Angela, I'm going to pass it over to you, and then we'll get into the Q&A. And yeah, thank you so much. Oh, and reminding people, I've already gotten a couple questions in. You could tweet us at @WilsonCEF or email elijah.patton@wilsoncenter.org. That's listed underneath the screen in front of you. Okay, go ahead, Angela.
Thank you, Jennifer. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to follow Alvin and Ned's talk with a quick overview of Chinese investments after the Belt and Road Initiative in Indonesia, highlighting the strong connection between investments in smelter plants to make stainless steel and coal power investments. So the plan is to start with a quick introduction about Indonesia and China's maritime Silk Road, and then I will show you some data to understand how Chinese investments have changed after the Belt and Road Initiative, explaining this connection between steel and coal power plants. And then I will conclude with some key insights from my research and key considerations about the future. So let's start with one of my favorite quotes, which basically says, no matter how much confidence China has in itself, it cannot realize the Belt and Road Initiative by its own. So in other words, this resonates with Alvin's talk by saying that my talk today is also not about Chinese investments going to Indonesia out of their own sole will, but actually they were welcomed and they were even sought after by the Indonesian government to fulfill its national development agenda. And this agenda started to materialize during Yudhoyono's presidency, but really consolidated when President Widodo was elected in 2014. And in this new development attitude inside Indonesia's government, China, like any other top partner like Japan, is seen as a close ally to bring much needed capital and technology to restructure the country's economy. And to the say of many, the strong alliance between China and Indonesia started from the very strong relations between Xi and Widodo, who have met very frequently between 2014 and 2017. So in the very big impetus of the Belt and Road Initiative to push a lot of these common agendas. And these meetings were not followed up just by a lot of talks and MOUs, but were followed up by a lot of real actions where we often see Widodo going to check on a lot of flagship projects for the Belt and Road Initiative. And so it's not a coincidence that Widodo's own initiative, the Global Maritime Fulcrum, has a lot in common with China's Maritime Silk Road. So for instance, both initiatives refer to heritage narratives of their glorious maritime pasts, and they're both focused on connectivity and trade, and also on infrastructure investments. So for Indonesia, this focus on maritime connectivity was also a direct response to a study from the World Bank that really showed that the port logistic was lacking, and this was a key barrier hindering economic growth. So one key question is, how did Chinese investments change from before to after the Belt and Road Initiative? And this chart answers these questions. So basically here you see the darker green bar, like being the investments before the BRI. and then the lighter green after the BRI. So we see actually a lot of mining investments before, and then these have moved somehow into coal power plants and minerals and metal manufacturing. And these are like the ones that have witnessed the largest increase. If you're wondering what's this all renewable energy about, it's mainly one very big hydropower project that is coming up in Kalimantan. So it also has a quite interesting environmental impacts, potentially very high because of the biodiversity in Borneo, and also some biomass investments and geothermal power. And also we see some new sectors, of Chinese investments after the Belt and Road Initiative, namely real estate, tourism, and ICT. And these were all very much sought after by the Indonesian government. So when I examined these two largest flow of investments, so the coal power investments and the steel investments, I actually realized that they are connected. And how did I realize that? Basically, I looked at all the coal power plants that were announced before and after the Belt and Road Initiative. And you can see that basically before the BRI, we have 7 coal power plants, and after we have 17. So 17 announcements for new coal power plants. Most of them, some of them actually were canceled or delayed after. But what you can see here that is quite interesting is that some of these are energy companies, but these 4 companies are not operating in the energy field. So they're actually steel companies and they're private companies. So basically what they do is they build quite large coal power plants to power their industrial parks to make stainless steel. What kind of plants are there? They are quite large and with lower type of technology, subcritical or supercritical, as opposed to other foreign built plants, for instance, by Japan. And what about the environmental and social impacts? So most investments are obviously at Indonesia's request in fossil fuels or in energy intensive sectors. So there are a lot of NGO reports showing worsening environmental conditions that are clearly visible when you visit these places, and I will show you in a moment. Also, there are claims that even though there are quite low environmental standards in Indonesia, these are not complied with by Chinese companies sometimes. And there are a lot of concerns over worsening health and safety issues around these parks. And there is obviously a differential treatment between Chinese and Indonesia's workers. However, when I looked at most of the young workers around these parks, they seemed very happy about their job since wages were twice the industry standards. So from now on, I'm going to show you some of the pictures from my fieldwork. This is the Indonesia Morowali Industrial Park, which is the largest stainless steel industrial park now, I guess, in Southeast Asia. And here you can see like the chimneys from the coal power plants in the background. And obviously this is a big truck transporting coal. This is how massive it looks from just an island on the opposite side. This is where the workers live and how the workers actually look super young, but quite happy. And these are the Chinese workers that just get off their shift and then they are transported back to the residential compounds. So they live quite in a segregated way. And this is another industrial park making stainless steel. And what struck me about this is that it was built after the Morowali Industrial Park. So it should look much newer, but actually looks older. So I wondered whether this could be a case of Chinese companies dismantling old plants in China and then moving them to Indonesia. And this is how the environment looks around these parks, which speaks for itself. Mountains of earth that are dug out and then found without the right concentration of minerals and just left there. And this is how this this area looks. So it's very beautiful and very quiet, a lot of like nice, quiet villages surrounded by greenery. So to conclude, we have 2 sides of the story. On the one hand, we have Xi Jinping pledge this September to stop building coal power plants abroad in a very significant step to reduce global emissions. We have seen that actually as a result of this, and also this shift in policy and a greater commitment from the PRC towards environmental leadership, that coal power financing has actually decreased a lot. So the blue part of this bar is China. And so we see that after 2015, there is very little financing to coal power plants. So the question is, what will this pledge mean for upcoming Chinese invested industrial parks? Will this mean a radical shift towards new ways of power generation, or perhaps we can increase, we can expect a decrease in overall industrial parks investments? And from the other side, we have Indonesia's pledge to phase out coal power plants by 2040, decommissioning a quarter of its coal capacity by 2030, yet still maintaining its coal production unchanged for the next foreseeable future to cover the rising demand from India, but also from China. So what will the future hold? We see clearly a pattern of maintaining business as usual for the next decade at least, while both countries have ratified the Paris Agreement and are taking more steps towards environmental governance. So there is this type of cognitive dissonance, right? Like doing something, you know, in theory, but not really in practice. But another important question is, will these investments lead Indonesia to a path similar to China's, with high economic growth, but at the expense of the country's environmental and social conditions? And I leave you with this question. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a beautiful last slide. What was that a picture of?
Oh, just it was automatic. Like sometimes you.
Oh, it's just automatic. I thought it was like, it looked like it was like, I'm like, did she get a drone to take a picture or something? Well, cool. No, that's great. I mean, you guys are doing really unique research, and I'm already getting questions from people even saying that they're really excited about it. But just reminding people, if you have a question, we're moving to the Q&A section here. Tweet us at @WilsonCEF or email Eli Patton. The email is down below. It's Elijah.Patton on the email. All right. So you guys all ready for Q&A? You have no choice. Well, I mean, you could always quit the Zoom, but I hope you wouldn't do that. Got it. First question I'm going to toss out to, let's start with Irina Liu, who is from the Rhodium Group, China office. My question is, how do the speakers see the recent relaxing of production and emission curbs this past month? I assume she's referring to domestically, so that might be you, Edmund. Specifically, what is the impact on larger decarbonization goals with the rollback of steel's carbon peak target from 2025 to 2030? Did that make sense to you, Edmund? Okay, we will have you answer that.
Yeah, this is a good question. I do think that the so what the Irene is referring to is last year in 2021, early media reports. So sorry, China puts out its 2060 carbon neutrality goal in late September. Subsequently, that was just kind of announced at a very high level. And the last year and a half has been work on actually implementing that into more granular targets and policies for individual sectors and players. The media reports, nothing official, but Chinese state media reports in March of last year said that the target for peaking emissions in steel would be something around 2025. This passed, I think this was released the document was formalized in January 20th of just last month. A set of guiding opinions for the steel sector that included, and that's an official sort of Chinese document term, but the important thing here is that it included a formal target of peaking emissions by 2030 for steel. And so I think there was a lot of reaction internationally and also among some Chinese stakeholders about, just reflecting that this seemed to be moving back from what we expected of a 2025 peak. I think that when I saw this, I would say a couple things. One, there were a variety of other targets that were included in that announcement. None of those were any different from what had been, to my knowledge, it's the high-level ones were not any different from what had been announced in early 2021. So the big change, or would have been expected, and what had been seen from other kinds of plans that have been out there before about scrap steel and things like that. So the big change is the formalization of a peaking target for later. And I do think that it reflects this tension between the trade-off of, I mean, what sort of she has described as in development and, I believe, environmental protection, ecological protection. And so we're seeing, under conditions of, as China continues to search to find a way forward with its economy, we see it's not a linear path. That being said, I think that the most important thing, while that target is quite conservative, I don't think that necessarily means that firms will that the sector will end up taking that kind of leeway. I think there's still a lot of space for peaking by 2025. And it simply reflects output production. Does output peak by 2025? That's a simple answer.
Yeah.
And given the ongoing moves around the real estate sector and other downstream users of steel, where there are some signals about increasing policy tightness in a big picture, that is a favorable environment still for an earlier peak. So it was, I think, disappointing to see that 2030, and it does create more leeway than having a 2025 target, but I don't think that necessarily means that China's going to end up taking all that leeway.
But so, and that kind of actually, your answer, I realized that Darren McGee, my buddy up at Hope and William Smith College, he again thanks me for bringing you guys together. And he echoes that you're saying reducing the emissions from iron and steel, of course, would have a big impact on real estate sectors. But it has been slowing down, right? But he says, do you think it's really, I guess you kind of answered, it's not that realistic. That, I mean, they are gonna, right now it seems like, because they've loosened the peak, or that they're gonna keep doing the steel. But something that I was kind of wondering is that, and this kind of gets to maybe Alvin's, is that there, because you showed those little charts where steel exports were really rising from China to the Philippines. What do you see? I mean, because that's another contradiction that, they can say, okay, we're gonna build less here, but they're exporting. I mean, do you see this market is going to keep growing in the Philippines? What can you tell us about tell us this side of the story, that, what about the steel and cement exports? Is that just going to be a growing field for China?
So it goes back to two things: infrastructure initiative in the country, the drive to create more like roads, bridges, and sort of like any sort of like infrastructure, and also the drive of real estate, the growth of real estate as well in the Philippines also comes in. Since 2014, there's been a major cities in the Philippines. You have like condominiums, high-rise buildings, and everything else. Those all require steel and cement. The political aspect of the story for me, apart from like sort of like what China is doing, is simply that businesses need to keep on going for really rich people. And this is like a market sort of like this is like a market that is funded by basically like government like support, and it gives an opportunity to like really local oligarchs and powerful elites to keep on like making money, and it goes back to electoral support as well, and it goes back to sort of like making it like it's basically winning. It's a win for everybody. Now the industrial sector of the country, you do have like top 10 cement sort of like manufacturers, and you have like only one big steel manufacturer in the country, but they can create different products, and at the same time there's actually a huge market for them, so they're not really competing against each other. It's actually a huge demand for both of the sectors, even if you do have Chinese players coming in either as exporters or investors.
But do you think that, but I'm struck with you had that one of those many colorful charts that you had was showing how, I mean, Chinese investment in actually building the cement plants and steel plants is growing, and it's being dispersed. I mean, is this something similar to what Angela was showing? Is that I mean, I guess the question is the steel industry in China kind of hedging their bets, and they're going to be expanding their manufacturing in the Philippines more just because it's going to be closing down in China?
Well, that's definitely a possible hypothesis to sort of like to propose. The percentage of that in sort of the overall like aggregate share of like cement and steel in China that goes to the Philippines, it's hard to say, but I definitely see this in the Philippines and Indonesia. You do have this like expansion of this like industries. The simple thing for me is simply that is especially for low level cement and steel, those heavy polluting sort of like cement and steel counterparts, it's very easy to build them, like very small amounts of them. It's very easy to do it. There's not a lot of intellectual property protection. They're environmentally corrosive, if you're a local elite and you have money, it's definitely easy to build this. And this is something I see happening all over the country.
But in the Philippines, and those are sometimes just without Chinese help. But are there also just, when I picture the steel industry, I'm thinking of big state-owned enterprises.
Yeah.
But are there also smaller companies? Because I know that when I lived when I was a Yingyu Laosher, an English teacher in China back in the 80s, even I was noticing that there were cement plants being built everywhere. And it's like, wow, I never really thought about that before. But is it, I'm not saying like it's mom and pop steel plants moving to Philippines, but are there provincial governments that are sending their plants to Indonesia and the Philippines?
For sure. A lot of so just in the Philippines, so the major SOEs, I only see, the top like 92 central SOEs in the Fortune 500. I think there's only one of them in the Philippines, but a lot of the other ones are either, the provincial SOEs or even the lower level ones. Again, with some money that comes in, it doesn't need to be a lot of money, but you can definitely build these things.
Yeah. What about Angela? Because you showed that great chart that maybe kind of wakes up everyone up like, whoa, steel companies are building coal-fired power plants. Are those all the big dog SOE plants, or some of them smaller steel plants too, from China?
Well, the ones connected to the industrial parks, they're actually private companies. And this is because there were a lot of waves of SOE reforms inside China to privatize a lot of companies. And I think a lot of these large companies have also been a result of this privatization efforts. I can try to come up with a chart, but basically I wanted to say that there are two main elements that propelled this stainless steel industrial parks investments. And they are the fact that Indonesian elites, like I guess Filipino elites, are also quite keen to develop anything related to mineral and mined goods. So there was a recent report basically called coal raption. So how many actually of the political elites have been linked to coal. So there is a very strong political interest. And secondly, actually, it's because of the cheap sources. So nickel in Indonesia is very cheap. And so what this has triggered is actually that the stainless steel in Indonesia is so cheap that has triggered anti-dumping laws from China, because now it's competing against China's domestic companies. So this is the chart that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. So in coal power plants, we see the big companies, right? Like the energy ones that are state-owned, the ones in yellow. And then we see actually a lot of large stainless steel companies that are privately owned.
Gotcha. All right, and actually, Darren McGee, anticipating you would say something like this, actually has a question. Can you say anything about the final disposition of the steel and stainless steel being produced in Indonesia? That is, what percentage is for domestic consumption versus export? And if we assume a 40-year lifespan for the coal-fired power plants being built in Indonesia, then there will be a lot of stranded coal-fired power plants mid-century. Has the Indonesian government made any mention of what will happen to those stranded assets? Who pays for them? So we got one coal and one steel question. What do you say, Angela?
Well, actually, the consumption has changed a lot. So before it was mostly exported back to China, but then it started to be exported to other places in Southeast Asia and also covering domestic consumption now. And a lot of these industrial parks are now moving to building electric vehicles batteries because nickel is also used for that. So that's another important aspect, that they're moving somehow into different industries. But like Indonesia's government officials are very smart, so they're always trying to keep the usage of these mineral goods. Like for coal, they're turning now to coal gasification, which is still propelling coal mining. For the usage of coal, yes, you're very right. There is at least another 30 years of these coal power plants, and the government, I haven't checked, doesn't look like they're going to have a dismissal plan. My take is that they're going to continue business as usual for the next, foreseeable future, right? So we'll see.
And okay, so I wanted to, before I go to Alvin to answer that question about where's the steel going, Edmund, you had your hand up a moment ago and I just talked right over you. Sorry. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think you had been asking about the kinds of firms that are going out. And while I can't speak to kind of firms that are going out necessarily, I can say just as from an industrial structure standpoint, I think as Alvin alluded to, central SOEs are not a major player in either of these sectors, in either steel or cement, not anything like they are in coal-fired power. So within China, you have sort of two big central SOE steel producers. They produce probably about 20%, I want to say, maybe 15-20% of total production. And in cement, I want to say it's two, I believe. And they probably have a bit higher share. I'd have to look at the data again, but cement and steel, both of them, particularly steel, is a very, it's not a very concentrated sector in China in a way that's different from other parts of the or other more wealthier countries. And you have a lot of provincial SOEs and smaller players as well who are in there.
And do the provincial SOE, do central or provincial governments, do they subsidize this industry anymore? Do they get benefit, or are they maybe were subsidized in the past and they're good?
I can't speak exactly to that. I can say that employment remains a sort of an important consideration in SOE decision-making in these sectors. And in some provinces, for instance, in Hebei, which is produces, I believe, for instance, the city of Tangshan produces 14% of China's steel. That's one city in the province of Hebei. It's along the coast. And so there are major impacts from employment changes in these sectors. And so those things are part of considerations. These are not, and yeah, a full answer to that involves going more into the bigger picture of kind
totally
of
geeky now.
But no, I know what you mean. So that's why I'm evading it. But yes, there's still, there are considerations for these firms that private sector firms don't necessarily have.
I think this is also a way to kind of lure people to listen to your podcast because there'll be more details there. Alvin, what about with that question with that Darren Heat asked about Indonesia, about like, again, most of the steel that's being produced in the Philippines just being used in the Philippines now as well?
So I do have some export data. They are getting export. It's hard to say which ones are getting exported, but they're strangely enough, there is a lot of exported like steel and cement coming from the Philippines towards somewhere else. I have that graph. I did not show it here. If I look at the numbers, I would say it's probably half and half. Half of them stay in the country, half of them are exported. Now I'm not super sure, like, okay, do they re-export it or do they produce new ones to export it somewhere else? One thing I found out from doing my research is, especially with the port entry data I have, there are many, many different types of steel and there are many, many different types of cement. And, if I were a steel nerd, I probably would know, but I'm not.
You're not Edmund.
I'm not Edmund, so I don't have the steel. There are 20, 30 steel commodities and different you use for construction. Of course, there's some basic ones like fobs and all these other things, but sort of like I don't know yet which ones stay in the country, which ones are used. I don't know which ones are exported, but it would be super interesting to find out sort of like this export platform if it is used as an export platform at all.
And is and in terms that you didn't mention it, but are the Chinese also building the coal-fired power plants in the Philippines to help fuel these industrial parks?
No, I don't. So there is no trend of like building large, highly integrated industrial parks in the Philippines, and you don't have the Chinese buildings coal-fired power plants as well. The biggest CFP construction companies are the Japanese. I think the Chinese have tried to construct two companies but it was in 2000. They tried to construct two CFPs in 2014, but not during the Duterte administration.
Okay, I think we're well. One quick thing, I do need to get a link to the coal eruption report because some people are asking for that link. Just so you know, and now I got Dr. Ankita Gangotra, a postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown University, said, "Here's my question for Edmund. Considering that China's average clinker content in cement and cement production emissions intensity is on an average lower than many other major cement producing parts of the world, what can other countries like the US learn from China when it comes to low carbon cement production?" And I have to interject in here that I do know, because I've had cement meetings before. I've had people from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, WRI, who in previous years had done a lot of cooperation with China, kind of looking at green cement type issues. So it has been, it's not like front page news, but it has been a productive area in the past of cooperation between the two countries. So what do you have to tell us there, Edmund, about Dr. Gangotra's question?
Yeah, this is actually a great question. Dr. Gangotra is totally right. As you can see here, this is a graph from a report by Ali Hassanbeghi and former Wilson Center fellow Cecilia Hahn-Springer on CO2 emission of cement in different parts of the world. And you can see that China is quite low, and the US is actually quite high. And that mostly reflects what Dr. Gangotra described, which is the clinker factor. The clinker factor is the share of clinker within the cement. The production of clinker is an intermediate product in cement production.
What is clinker? Because not everyone's going to know what that means. Just real quick.
Yes. So clinker is an intermediate product used in the production of cement. It is the dominant component of cement. It is a mixture of limestone and clay and some other materials, basically, that gets fired in a kiln and then heated to high temperatures and produced in that process. And when it's produced, it releases carbon emissions as part of that. And so that's why when you have low clinker in your cement, that means you're going to have low carbon emissions, because the production of clinker itself has chemical reactions that release carbon. Now, unfortunately, I would say that the main reason that Chinese cement has a low clinker factor is associated with quality. And this is actually something Chinese clinker factor has been trending upwards over time, because clinker is an important component. Basically, really low clinker factor indicates it tends to be associated with very low quality cement. And China has actually phased out sort of some of its lowest grades of cement quality, which is basically part of what's driving up its clinker factor. The US can learn a lot, though, from, I think, China and a number of other countries with lower clinker factor in like the European Union, Canada, things like that, in opening up its standards around cement. So standards in cement tend to be fairly conservative in the US. You can do cement, or many countries do cement with lower clinker factors and are able to get strong performance as well. So that's something that's worth looking into. And there are a lot of examples of inspiration for that.
Okay, but would we guess, and I don't know if you know this, Alvin, do you know that if the cement that's being produced in the Philippines, maybe it's too early to know, are people looking at are they high energy intensive cement plants? Do you know anything about the quality, or that's your next stage of research?
So as far as I know, so I did some interviews on this before the pandemic. They're really low quality, like cement, like factories. Meaning, going back to what Edmund said, like the main issue is really the clinkers. It's really hard to decarbonize them, sort of the entire process. So the big issue is, and a lot of the cement like factories, when people are building them, you have this like provincial SOEs or this private firms, and sometimes they would just give money. It's hard to say what else they would give. Yeah.
Okay. Jake Schmidt he's the Senior Strategic Director of International Climate. He's spoken for me many times. He's at the Natural Resources Defense Council. He asks, are there external factors or forces that could shift up China's domestic actions on steel and cement? If steel doesn't peak until 2030 and cement doesn't peak until 2023, there's no chance that the world can meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius cap. So, Wandanla, what do we say, Edmund? Are they, or any of you, because you guys are working in this space?
I'll take liberty and share a couple thoughts here with another slide. So the first thing to start doing is get our act together at home. I showed the cement intensity there, right? We're pretty high in the US. We need to bring that down. And in steel also, we're in better shape in the US, but there's still, it's still almost 100,000 kilograms of CO2 per ton of crude steel, if I'm reading that right. That doesn't make sense. Well, anyhow, it's still a lot.
Wait, can you go back to that slide again, just so give people a second to look at it? So the US, we're on the low.
We are on the low end. The main reason is that we tend to produce our steel by recycling it in in what are called electric arc furnaces, which use electric power rather than direct combustion of coal.
And we also don't produce nearly as much as cement as we used to.
Steel, yes, cement and steel. That's the case for both. These are intensity figures, so they're per ton. but also overall emissions, we're going to be pretty small compared to China as well. We still have a lot of way to go, though. So get our act together at home, and that means reducing the green premium, incentivizing U.S. investments that can bring down low carbon steel and cement production costs. That means incentivizing investments in hydrogen, in carbon capture and storage, other things like that. And you lower the cost here, that can lower the cost for other countries as well. Second is let's work on cooperation in industrial decarbonization. So there's a lot of work still to be done on getting standards harmonized around the world around carbon accounting. And that's really important. So carbon accounting is an understanding how much emissions does something produce. There's a measurement process. We need to have good protocols for that. We need to have good protocols also for financing that in green finance. And also cooperate around things like CCUS, tech investments, where issues are, it's pretty relatively low in, low kind of political sensitivity in industrial cooperation.
And because because in last year at in the 11th hour of the climate talks, of course, you guys know that the U.S. and China climate declaration, and it's kind of a broad opening, not a lot of details of what will happen. But would you think that this sounds like what you just said, that it's not necessarily politically sensitive? Is that really true?
I think as things go, it is the least sensitive would be probably the best way to put it, which is not necessarily saying much in some ways because everything is very sensitive. But you take the opportunities where you can get them. And I do think, green finance in particular is an area where the US and China are leading a working group in the G20 on that together. And there's some good track 2 dialogues that are going on right now around those issues. So I think that there is, standards, green finance, things like that. Those are places you can rally around. And my understanding is also that there are at least players within the US who have talked who have an interest in building stronger cooperation around CCUS discussions. US is a global leader in CCUS. It should be involved in those discussions. So the last thing I'm going to say is just, we got to think about linking market access and carbon footprints. So introduce mechanisms that encourage low carbon procurement by US companies. That might be carbon pricing, but we don't really actually ever pull that off. So let's think also about building code requirements, right? Government buildings should have certain requirements if you build something new about carbon intensity of materials. And that means that if you want to be able to get that market, you need to be able to make those standards. The second thing is the carbon clubs. So shared sort of import pricing around carbon tariffs. So the EU has proposed something like that. The US was pretty hesitant about it last year. I think that is, this is a series of quotes by Chinese steel players about how the EU's actions make them take note, about how the implementation of a carbon tariff is something that they are concerned about as a competitiveness challenge. And Europe is not even that big of a market for Chinese steel. It's like 5-10% of Chinese steel exports. So this is the kind of impact that happens when the US gets in that market too. That's bigger as well, right? So when you're setting these kinds of tariffs, this is something that Chinese producers, they respond to their domestic concerns, but they also are paying attention to potential export markets, at least in steel. And we need to leverage that. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, you definitely need to share some of these slides because these are going to be good quotes for people to look at. But let me open it back up to Angela and Alvin. So, because here we're talking about US-China potential cooperation or kind of being an impetus for greening cement and steel. What could be the role, or do you see any role for Indonesia and the Philippines? Is there any interest, or is this just like is Philippines just looking at, we're following the Chinese development model, we'll clean up later? What do you say? Let's see. How about Alvin?
So if there's going to be some high level of sort of like declaration, I think obviously there will be some effect. I do think that it's less about the Chinese development model being followed by the Philippines. I think it's more about there's a political economy reason of why these firms are expanding, and it really goes along with giving opportunities to economic elites sort of benefit from the projects, at the same time gives political elites the opportunity to expand their legitimacy and sort of like their power as well. It's hard to say what the effect is, but there could be. But yeah.
What do you say, Angela?
Yeah, I'd say Indonesia is quite similar to the Philippines. So there are a lot of elite interests, and we are talking more about browning than greening in a sense, right? So it's just turning coal power plants into coal gasification, or turning, steel plants into slightly less polluting, steel power plants, but they are nothing, no breakthroughs. I don't think there's any talk about using new technologies like hydrogen, because I think it's still even quite new inside China. I actually wanted to ask Edmund about it. And actually, like one breakthrough that Chinese helped in, because this, I think last year was the first year that for the first time, Chinese investments in renewable energy were above Chinese investments in fossil fuels. And in the case of Indonesia, there was a joint venture between a Chinese and Icelandic company that helped develop a lot of geothermal power plants. And that is something very big for Indonesia, because Indonesia holds 40% of the world's resources in terms of geothermal power. So that's something that was a breakthrough, yeah.
That sounds promising. But then like two questions for Angela, and also it relates to you too, Alvin. First of all, the NGO citizens in each of these countries. I mean, there is concern about, I think, is it the air pollution, other environmental problems with that? Is there a big movement to kind of push for, you know, cleaner and greener skies and water and soil there in Indonesia? I mean, I'm, you know, kind of mirroring what happened in China. And then, well, I'll leave it at that one. I'll ask the second one next. What do you say, Angela, and then Alvin?
Yeah, I think in Indonesia I was very much surprised by the activities of a lot of really great environmental NGOs that are going there and actually taking data out of, so documenting a lot of the environmental and health impacts around these places. So coal eruption is just one example of these coalitions, because these local coalitions of NGOs like JATAM, for instance, they team up with more international NGOs. So they form kind of very large coalitions of NGOs to work on a lot of topics, and they were really informed, and they really took a lot of steps to help a lot of communities to also, for instance, go to court in certain cases where, for instance, coal power plants took a lot of the livelihoods of the people that lived surrounding them. So yeah.
And Alvin, what about in the Philippines? I've been doing a lot of work on plastic waste, and I know that in the Philippines, like on plastic waste, you guys have a very lively and active NGO sector connected with global players. But what about in this coal and steel sector?
So you don't have the same like NGO civil society space for cement and steel. You know, plastic is a very urban issue, and you have this like middle class mobilization of like NGOs. A lot of the cement and steel firms are sort of concentrated in the provinces, and in many ways, a lot of people are affected. But there's always a question of how do they mobilize and what's their capacity after. And you know, because of this government that came in, where autocratic like capacity increased, the degree of mobilization from this province, from this provincial like I would say movements have definitely decreased. So you don't have the same fervor as in Indonesia, unfortunately.
Okay, just real quick, Edmund, is anything to say about the green hydrogen? I'm actually probably going to do a meeting on it because it keeps percolating up in my email about people asking me about green hydrogen. Is that something the Chinese are seriously looking into? Because we know there's a lot of talk on it, but I was wondering, is it like CCUS, that big talk, but takes a lot of capital to do it, and it's going to move like a, you know, slow?
I think that, so there is strong interest. It's pretty high on sort of what I like to think about the hype cycle, which is, you know, kind of like technology's early stage, you know, this point at which sort of the hype peaks, and then there's a kind of a sifting that happens, and then they mature more. So I'd say hydrogen is somewhere pretty high on the hype cycle. There will be a sifting that will happen. There will be a cooling. We're not quite into that yet. And that's the case in China as well. So I think first half of 2020, I want to say there were 30 plus local governments and doing policies around promoting hydrogen. And that's, to be clear, that's both carbon intensive hydrogen as it's produced now and low carbon hydrogen. But there are a lot of things to spread green hydrogen, that is low carbon hydrogen produced by renewable energy. You need to have the infrastructure, and maybe you do that by doing some gray hydrogen that's economic right now first. But there are some really exciting, interesting projects that are happening and firms that are taking a real interest in it. And so it's going to be, I think it will stay as part of the mix. And in particular in China, the thing that makes me, there's more, there's more economic potential in some ways in hydrogen, or there are specific economic opportunities in hydrogen that we don't see in CCUS. And that is that China can make electrolyzers, the green hydrogen, that is the machines that turn the electricity and use the electricity to produce the hydrogen. They can do that, and they can do that really well in the same way they've done solar panels, because they're modular, they can produce a lot, bring the cost down, because China's very good at producing a lot of things and learning how to bring the cost down. So that's a good industry for China to get into. It's getting into it, it's going to stay in it. And there are some good industrial policy synergies that I think are going to keep China.
And they could probably also think of taking it global. My Eli, who's been pulling in all the questions, tossed a question in here that kind of, he put it as you were answering here, like about, because China is decarbonizing. That's clear. It's a big policy. And so more regulations coming. And he asked, are businesses ready to react? And in some way your answer is like, well, maybe it's these new industries that could help, outside the steel industry, and, this green hydrogen, that's like a new sector that could rise. All right. We just got a couple minutes left. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to start with, I'm going to ask you, like, where are you going to take your research next? You guys are, you totally have proven, your bona fides on cement, steel, and coal. What's next for you guys in terms of your research? Because of course I'll invite you back. Angela?
I'm going to look, I'm actually building a big database of industrial parks in the whole of Southeast Asia. And I want to look at like how industrial parks are connected to coal power plants. What kind of industrial parks are they? Not only from China, but also from other countries. So I'm interested to see whether, for instance, Chinese companies tend to invest more in Chinese-led industrial parks as opposed to Japanese companies and so on, and how these industrial parks and the industries inside are connected to energy. So that's my next step.
And that could be useful information even for countries like the EU and US to kind of know those kinds of dynamic, to know the pressure points. Okay. Alvin?
Well, expanding the cement steel infrastructure interface in other countries by building host country data sets on a granular level. I think that's super important. Doing a political analysis of them, how they're linked to important people in the country, and moving to the more environmental direction, working with physical geographers and scientists to sort of like understand the local level impacts and sort of the climatic impacts of these sectors.
Yeah, and also that, and I liked how you said it because you're saying like, in a post-pandemic world, you and Angela are going to get your boots on the ground again, basically talking to people.
That is the plan.
That's the plan. And also that, what's kind of cool is that I think that me bringing you three together, that all three of you have been talking together, because it looks like there could be this could be the three musketeers moving forward on the topic. What about you, Edmund? Where are you going to go next with your work?
That's the ongoing question. I'm just started the PhD, and so kind of still sketching out the full PhD agenda. But I do have some projects in the short term. I'm working with some colleagues at Columbia on carbon emissions disclosures by Chinese companies, and what companies are doing to disclose and what they're not doing to disclose carbon risks and carbon emissions. So that's the near term. Long term, I think continue to look at the political economy of decarbonization transitions in China and also in India.
Mm-hmm. Two big players. Well, good. But you guys this is an amazing conversation today, because again, steel, cement never sounds very exciting, but it was exciting. And it's an important topic, again, if you're concerned about decarbonization. Noting that I'd like to also to tell people that are listening right now that tomorrow the Wilson Center's Asia program, CEF, and is putting on our China Fellows presentations. I'm going to be chairing another panel with another group of this generation of cool people that are doing kind of BRI and Southeast Asia overseas work. I'm doing that at 10, but go click at the Wilson Center on my website or Asia Program's website to see the full agenda all day. We got all these different speakers that, again, like my three musketeers here, just doing really cutting edge work that, yeah, I'm really excited that, it's good information for everybody. And I'm glad we were able to bring it to also a Washington audience. Thank you very much, everyone. Any final last say your goodbyes? Good. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. I want to thank the audience. You guys gave us great questions. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.